Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the podcast, Managing Director of Strategic Treasurer Craig Jeffery joins Managing Director of Deluxe Corporation Dave Robertson to discuss the 2020 Modernizing AP and AR Processing survey results. They discuss the mind shifts and key findings around the influence of recent disruptions, calibration of various pain points that drive change, and other motivators to upgrade AP and AR processes. Listen in to learn more.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Craig Jeffery, and today's episode is called Modernizing AP and AR Processing. In this, we look at some of the survey implications. I'm here with Dave Robertson, who's the Managing Director of Deluxe Corporation. Welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thank you, Craig. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, so I wanted to dive into this survey. Maybe we start off with the drive to digital. As we look through the data, this move towards automation, an actual movement as well as a change in mindset seems impressive. So what are you seeing here, and is there anything that's changing or anything of note?
You know, if you were to ask folks prior to the pandemic, do they want to be more digital? I think they would all say yes, and certainly some companies made a lot of progress toward it, and even the banks themselves, some of them made progress toward it. However, it's one thing to have it as a nice to have and another to have it as something that's required. And I think with the pandemic, what that did was it really revealed the stresses that occur when you're in a manual environment, when you're dealing with paper. And so the pandemic really underscored a level of urgency around becoming digital and heightened it. So what we're seeing now is just renewed emphasis, and people are realizing this is not nice to have. It's something that you absolutely need to get to in order to run an effective financial supply chain. So one of the silver linings for the pandemic is just that it really has brought getting digital to the forefront.
So with this movement towards digital to the forefront, rather than just talking about it or making it maybe a strategy of hope, how has that changed the perspective, I guess, beyond just this, it's no longer nice to have, it's urgent. What are we thinking about here for, what's becoming digital? How broad is the look?
Yeah, it's a great area to explore. And I like to think of it first at a very simple level as internal, external. And clearly becoming digital with your external counterparties requires careful coordination. That takes time. And, if you think about a typical company and their suppliers and customers, you're just going to see a wild spectrum of highly manual entities all the way up to very sophisticated digital entities. But as I think about job one, kind of getting your own house in order, what we've seen is companies really focus on first getting things digital as quickly as possible. So that might be, for one company, having the ability to input remittance data from an ACH payment. It might be for another one, the ability to take in PDF remittance data, have that be automatically read and fed into a digital system. It's the ability to create a uniform data taxonomy and format where everything can be normalized and put into a common system, not only for integration into the ERP and GL, but also as a basis for queries, for automated reporting, and even for governance, writing escalation around certain data considerations. So really getting that internal environment to a digital environment is something 100% within the control of a company. It can be done even if customers are sending emails, faxes, what have you. A company can still be internally digitally. The second effort, I think, is really more external, and that's working with trading partners so that they can accept digital output. They can send digital output, they can send things in the right format. That's a longer path, and we've seen people put energy there and feel like it's not worthwhile. So what Deluxe is observing right now is a much greater focus on, okay, supplier, customer, whatever you're gonna do, I may not like it, I'm gonna try to get you as far along as I can, But regardless of what you are going to do, I'm going to have a way to convert that to a digital environment and get all the downstream benefits of automation, intelligence, coordination, the ability to have multiple people work off of a common data set and a common workflow. I'm going to do that for myself because that's within my control, and I can get a very high ROI and a high level of agility around that.
What are some of those ways that people are getting things as digital as they can, as quickly as they can? What maybe some of the things that are been highlighted in the survey or that you've seen in the industry, especially on the external front?
I'll touch on one thing, which is when I think of one of the strengths of Deluxe, it's that we're sort of very focused on that transitional service. So there are companies out there that are building, purely digital, blockchain, multi-global things that, maybe you have to build a bridge to. We're very much rooted in the present environment. So one of the things we've seen, and I'll just give you an example of the pandemic, companies that had in-house check printing operations were in a panic because they couldn't get to their location. They couldn't distribute the work to get the authorizations and the permissions to get the check out. Well, Deluxe, for example, has a product that would take a check register and convert it to an electronic payment. So in this manner, they're able to do all the permissioning in an electronic environment. They can distribute that geographically, and then Deluxe can do the hard work of converting that to an ACH, to a digital check, a debit card load, and give the choice to the payee of how they want to receive that payment. So that's an example of, a lot of times we think getting to digital is this long process, but with that solution, a company could become digital in just 2 days by simply redirecting the check register to a third party, either their bank or Deluxe, and have that executed in the manner that the supplier would like. So to me, these transitional services, I think, are highly powerful. And instead of thinking of digital as this gigantic effort to get everybody on EDI or ISO 20022, we don't need to go there day one. That's great. If you can get somebody there, that's fantastic. But there's a set of transitional services that can really get you to be digital very quickly with your customers and suppliers.
Yeah, I like that term, transitional services, this idea of your 0% digital, 100% manual, and then the future state, you want to be 100% digital, 0% manual, but that's a lot easier said than done, this idea of how do we shortcut through the transition to more digital, or shortcutting, by whether it's leveraging outsourcing other tech. What are some, any other digital techniques or services that people are using that help get us there that we saw in the survey?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The technology is amazing. I think, Craig, you termed the nomenclature bots with eyes and bots that log into systems. I think this artificial intelligence has been here for a while, but it's being tuned in very practical, accessible ways. So, for example, Deluxe works with banks and companies with both bots with eyes and bots that log into systems, whether it's automatically reading a PDF of a remittance, or maybe even logging into a buyer portal and downloading critical information and feeding it back into a company's data so that it can apply cash and explore exceptions. The one issue I wanted to also note is that I think in the past, a lot of the focus around digitization was focused on the company itself and not on the counterparties. And what we've been really pushing on in the industry is giving the buyer and the supplier choice. So if I say, I want to be digital with you, but here's exactly what you have to do to be digital, you're only bringing along a small part of your supplier or customer base. But if you say to that base, I want to be digital with you, and here are all the options I will give you to be digital, now you've given them a real powerful solution. So for example, I might want to pay people with ACH and embed the remittance information in the addenda. Well, some of my smaller customers may not be able to handle that, or my smaller suppliers. So if I say to them, I'll give you this ACH, but I'll also give you a portal, or I'll give you a PDF, or I'll give you these solutions, you're giving your customers and your suppliers more options to take advantage of the digital information. And if you think about a pandemic or any other kind of disruption, the tighter integration you have across that financial value chain, the more agile and secure you're going to be. And the most comprehensive integration is where you don't just fix on one solution, but you are embedding choice for the payee, for the recipient, for the payer as well, and you're being very flexible.
I guess before we move to the next section of things I wanted to cover is, we talked about, and in the survey, there's a lot of information about complexity that organizations are facing, and you've already touched on the complexity of a manual environment, the complexity of a transition between manual to automated and having to deal with that. Some other elements had to do with things like multiple ER systems. I didn't know if there's any commentary you have on how that creates a challenge in organizations, because before we move on to how those are being addressed.
Yes, I think, Craig, that's something, I know you've probably seen it in your consulting work as well. We've seen it where there's this real dilemma for companies. Do I rationalize my ERP, which is a lengthy, painful process, it's fraught with risk, or do I just manage with multiple ERPs? And I think the nice thing is, you don't really want to fragment your data, but there are overlay solutions that can come in and address things. So one of the things that has been a focus of our product development is really giving companies and the bank's customers the ability to put in these overlay solutions in place. So if I'm a company and we've even seen things like 7 to 14 ERP systems, but I want to have a common model for my accounts payable or my accounts receivable, I can do that if an intermediary is willing to create a data structure and sync that with all the individual ERPs, and then have that data structure drive the workflow, the decisioning, the automation. And so that's something that's really taken off. It might be called integrated receivables or integrated payables, but those terms are fairly plastic, and it's really all about creating almost a virtual data layer and being able to write the automation and all the workflow and configure that at an enterprise level, even when there's multiple ERPs underneath it.
I think in terms of moving the conversation over to what's been changing, a lot of questions in this survey asked about how there's some shifts or what's occurring and what's changing in terms of this move to a process view. You talked about SDP or end-to-end in our organization plus our counterparty's organization. And this is supplemented with different types of tech elements, some of which you just discussed. But what are some of the other shifts that are happening, and are there other catalysts for these? I know COVID drove people to outsourcing, and you can maybe explain that further, but what else should we be thinking about? What other learning can we derive from this information?
Yeah, I think, Craig, we're going to look back at COVID and say, this was terrible, certainly, and stressful, but from a standpoint of payments and treasury, there are many positives that came out of it. So one thing at a very high level is I think it really shone a light on interconnectedness and interdependence. And so in many cases, and that had a couple of flavors to it. So one flavor was maybe I was a company executive, and prior to COVID, I really thought about outsourcing or partnering as risky because now I'm relying on someone else. But in fact, the level of scale that it takes to really execute resiliency and build redundancy and resiliency into something like, checking or remittance or even some of the analytical activities, it's really an order of magnitude where a partner might have much greater capabilities. So we saw many mindsets shift around partnering, where instead of thinking about outsourcing as something that was a loss of control, it now is seen as something that can provide resiliency, flexibility, and greater safety. So that's one thing that jumps right out. The second thing I think as well, and whether it's credit risk or liquidity, there's this recognition of interdependence. If someone's having a problem, that's going to create a problem for me. And one of the brilliant things that Strategic Treasurer did in this survey was really look at straight-through processing. How is that defined? And it uncovered the fact that a very small percentage of companies really thought of STP, straight-through processing, to encompass customers and suppliers. And I think the pandemic is going to cause many companies now to say, you know what, if it's straight-through processing, it doesn't stop at my border anymore. It now has to include the customer and the supplier, because if there's a disconnect outside of my company, it may hurt as much as if the disconnect were inside my company. So I think you're really seeing massive mind shift changes around the scope of the financial value chain to be engineered. And you're also seeing it around the receptivity toward partnering. And that's going to have a long-term impact where I think companies are going to focus more narrowly on strategically what they're great at and architecting a really resilient financial supply chain. And they're going to turn to partners that can not only help them execute what they need to do, but also integrate far more deeply and more effectively with their buyers and suppliers.
Yeah, I like that the mindset change or the mind shift in those two areas, like you said, partnering and scope on this end to end. I can't but help mention that quote: "If you optimize part of the process, you sub-optimize the whole." And we see that all the time. It's like even within the company, and then once you do the end to end within the company, you have another trading partner. So how do we make sure we're not dumping something they can't use, which creates a defect and there's a call? So I think you really hit something important there with your comment on that.
If you look at this survey results as well, it shows that Treasury, accounts payable and accounts receivable are sort of in different realities. So Treasury, very centralized, highly automated, knowledge workers that have written a lot of analytics, whether it's around forecasting or risk or managing against debt covenants. But then as you move to AP and as you move to AR, you see that there are more manual activities, there are more risks to be addressed, and quite frankly, there's a lot more intelligence that can be driven to these areas. And I think we're going to start seeing companies put a lot more focus into improving these areas, because certainly the gaps were revealed through the stress test that was COVID.
So putting more emphasis on those gaps, how would you summarize what was learned about AR? What changed there?
I think one thing that changed was just the risk and the cost of manual processes was a huge impact, because if all of a sudden I'm starting to have trouble collecting from my customers, if there's anything around just getting the cash in the door, applying the cash, analyzing that data, anything that slows that down reduces the time I have to manage risks. And not even just to manage risks, to understand the risks, to analyze the data, to have that at my fingertips. And so I think, to some extent, accounts receivable did not get the same level of focus around automation and analytics that Treasury and then later accounts payable received. So one of the main shifts we've seen is just a lot more senior focus within companies on improving accounts receivable processing, automating it, digitizing it, and beginning to make sense of all the data underneath it. That's certainly one huge change. And I think the second change we've seen is really a focus on how do we work more effectively with buyers and suppliers. If there's a risk they're facing, how do we understand that? How do we manage that? If they have a risk, if they have a hiccup and they no longer can accept a certain payment type, how can we flexibly continue to do business with them? So the need for agility and interdependence is huge. And then, the third thing that we saw certainly in the survey results was a material percentage of companies indicated they ran into problems with banks or third-party processors not being able to deliver during the pandemic. And I think sometimes, in effect, all these companies are doing a risking of their vendors and partners, but maybe it wasn't rigorous enough, because not everybody came out of this without some very severe hiccups. And so I think we're going to see both banks and corporations scrutinizing their partners and saying, okay, if I'm really relying on you for these mission critical activities, how do I know that you're going to be able to deliver? What is your resiliency? What are your plans for a business contingency? And maybe we're going to see a bit more rigor in assessing that because, judging from what we experienced, which was frantic phone calls from banks and companies looking for somebody to help them out, there were a material number of companies that were left in the lurch early in the pandemic.
Yeah, certainly we heard and saw a lot of that as well, not just through the survey. Dave, as we talked about some of the shifts, and some of those that we talked about had to do with this process view. But what are people to do? Let's be a little more prescriptive using some of the data that we've seen. And I know we talked about partner capability, this outsourcing idea, and we've covered some of that. But what are the other challenges on the resource side that can help us think about it? And when I mention resources, it might be within an operational area like AR or AP, and also IT. I know we found information about what are some of the gating items, and resources is one of the biggest gating items towards making changes to a more digitized process.
I think that was one of the interesting findings of the study was just there is a desire for automation. The demand for outsourcing, either whole or partial, is huge. So there's no lack of demand for it. But when you looked at what was actually changing, you saw pretty moderate change within accounts payable, and within accounts receivable, lots of plans to change, but not as much actual change yet occurring. And so I think there's this view that I can't get there because I don't have the IT resources. It's not important enough for the management time. Or, I really don't believe that the technology can handle the complexity of our environment. So I think this is both a real issue, but it's also partly a perception issue. I think there's been so much advancement in the last, 3 years even, to harness technology around automation to make it easier to adopt, to require less heavy lifting on the part of the adopting company. And the value equation is also much greater than many companies are looking at. I think some are looking at it as a pure efficiency play, and maybe they don't want to lay off staff, but there's a lot of upside potential as well. So I think companies can educate themselves a bit more on the business case. Banks can help with this too, showing how automation can improve recovery of deductions, reducing the cost of payments, optimizing the balance sheet, and really maximizing the liquidity available to the company. And in some cases, even strategically, if you're improving your buyer and supplier relationships in very competitive fields, that's going to have an impact on winning business and being able to deliver. So the flip side of that is, as an industry and as a provider, as part of Deluxe, we need to continue to push to make our solutions easier to adopt, a lighter IT touch. I think one of the things we strategically try to do is put as much of the mapping complexity and the integration complexity, putting that into our environment for the highly sophisticated customers, building out API environments where we can jointly collaborate and really turn things into messages and real-time interaction. So there's ongoing work to do with that. I'd be lying if I'd said we'd solve that. It's a journey we're on, and it gets better every quarter as we release things. But again, I think that education, whether it's a provider like Deluxe or a banker or a consulting firm, really making companies aware of what they can do within their own environment to get a quick payback and without really just tying up a ton of resources that are scarce.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion there on what's really the broader business case and how valuable that is in communication. And you mentioned banks a couple times. They're certainly massive players in the cash conversion cycle, whether it's AR related, AP related. All these changes have a significant impact on them, and they have clients that run the range. You talked about people, companies should educate themselves on, what's available and what's the type of impact they can have. Well, they have customers that are on the bleeding edge, pushing them along, and others that are, laggards, very, very far in the back end. And I guess when we think about these changes in directions of mindset, of technology, what should a banker think? What should they be saying and doing to help bring these companies that are their customers along?
So this is an area that I directly work in. So when I joined Deluxe, the idea was to provide some consulting-like capabilities on top of our products, really initially to help the banks. So help them find who the prospects are and why, and help them sell. And where our customers have been very successful is working with us first to mine their data. So if I'm a bank, I know what payment channels and payment media are coming in on the receivable side and going out on the payable side. I know from their account structure what some of their accounting configuration might be. I know how they're using data. And with all that information, I can predict where they can create value. So I might know for one customer, hey, they need to just digitize what's in front of them. Whereas for another, maybe they need to pull the data together, automate the cash application. Maybe they need to drive higher adoption of digital disbursements. So right off the bat, as a banker, if I'm mining this data, I'm gaining incredible insights as to where my customers' opportunities lie. The second thing is really the role of the banker has shifted. Bankers now must be very advisory. They need to be able to walk the process. They need to do the discovery to uncover and qualify the opportunity and then to structure the solution. So the good news is this does happen. We're working with banks that are having tremendous success. One of our partner banks just sold the largest treasury management deal in the history of the bank, and it was through some of these more value-added digital solutions. And a second bank, which has been just a tremendous relationship and advisory bank, we're finding that even though these solutions are cutting edge, half the clients that they're onboarding are under 50 million in revenue. So, the other message I would have for banks is don't think of these services as things for the Global 5,000. These are mainstream products. They're highly accessible and highly valuable to middle market companies. And it's not going to be too long before, we're going to figure out how to make these accessible and powerful for small businesses as well.
Yeah, the ongoing movement of this democratization of tech downstream in size, I guess it won't let up. Some good points there. Dave, I want to give you a chance for any final thoughts, words of wisdom, either on the survey or just advice to an AR professional, an AP professional.
I guess I would maybe sum up some of the most interesting things that came out of the research, Craig, because I really do see them as calls to action for treasury and working capital professionals. The first one, which really sang out loud and clear, was the value of thinking comprehensively, not just end-to-end within the company, but really thinking about the buyer and supplier and the process that includes them, the decisions that include them, and really architecting a very agile, flexible model for AR and AP so that you're bringing the buyers and the suppliers along rather than saying, here's my beautiful, structure. Please come in the front door. Don't come in the side door. Don't try to come in through the roof. But the more flexible and agile and customer and supplier centric the model, the better success you're going to have. The second is really drilling down into the value creation that can occur. So at the end of the day, is processing a payment and applying a payment the real value add, or is that just the foundation? You do it well and you're really adding value around insights, around cash forecast, collection strategy, quality of the customer payment experience and billing experience. So digitizing and automating, yes, it does deliver efficiency. Yes, it does deliver greater accuracy, but go into that really thinking about what you as a business leader can do to create value within the company, because the minute you get into a digital environment, even if there's some paper on the outside of that, if you're in a digital environment, what you can do with that data to create value is almost endless. And so really focus on that. Don't just get caught up in the operational aspects, which are critical. You got to get them right, but also focus on the value creation. I think that's very important to keep in mind.
Yeah, excellent points. Dave, thanks so much for your time on this podcast and also for the research work.
Well, thank you, Craig. I appreciate having this opportunity, and I also appreciate the work that Strategic Treasury is doing just to advance the industry as a whole. So these podcasts, your webinars, your publications, I don't know how you sleep doing it all, but it's very impressive and highly valuable to everyone. So thank you for that.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.